The first sheet is brittle enough to cut the finger. It bears a stamp that changed its name 3 times. People's Commissariat, Ministry of Communications, something with a star. The date is February 29th, 1948, a leap day that does not belong to calendars but insists on being filed. Subject: Transient Telegraphic Interference, Yakut ASSR. A clerk has underlined 2 words, transient and Yakut, as if the vast and the brief offended him when placed together. The memorandum describes a recurring burst of tones heard on magnetotelephones between Oymyakon and Tomtor. 31 notes, each separated by a breath, then silence, then a repeat, as if the wire were remembering the hand that rang it. The lineman who wrote the description had been a sapper in 1943 and refused poetry since Kursk. The phrase is circled in red by someone who disliked verbs with memory. The route was a winter road on poles, pine spared from the Gulag's scythe because it carried voices. Every few versts, a hut with a stove and a ledger, and a man with hands cracked like river ice. In one hut, the ledger lists fuses and paraffin and bread. Then, on February 29th, a new line, spiral. The word is in block letters and off-center, as if the writer had been forced to choose between spelling and heat. The next page is missing. The page after that smells faintly of fish and resin and carries the outline of a cup. Locals already had a folk name for the thing, the Sarek Spiral, after a bend in the Indigirka, where the river turns in on itself and seems to consider its course. Old women said that the air over the bend sometimes wrote circles in snow that never fell. Hunters swore you could hear a wheel creak in the sky. None of that appears in the file, which prefers nouns like interference and anomaly. But a pencil in a margin, in a woman's hand, rare among these pages, adds, heard on the first day of spring. In Yakutia, spring is a legal fiction. On paper, it begins before the air permits it. Perhaps that is why the Spiral chose it for a signature. In 1952, a new transmitter on the Lena, built to push Moscow into permafrost, reported line occupancy by unknown cadence on a leap day evening. The engineer on duty noted 4.627 kHz, then crossed it out and wrote approx. His chief, a red banner man who swore by valves and hated ghosts, requisitioned a direction-finding truck. The truck ate petrol, plowed frozen ruts like a ship, and returned with a triangle whose apex lay not in a village or a mine or a camp, but in a white field east of Ust-Nera. Source traced to nowhere, the report says, and yet present. The word nowhere is underlined 3 times, then erased with the kind of eraser that leaves pink scabs in paper. The NKVD, already renamed, but the old syllables kept their teeth, sent a captain with a suitcase that clicked and a throat that made every sentence sound like an instruction. He interviewed linemen who had heard the tones and wives who had heard their husbands hear them. He confiscated a child's toy telephone made of tin and twine because it evidenced a culture of listening. He climbed into the hut at Sarek Bend and stood with his hat in his hands, as men do in churches and engine rooms. The stove breathed. The wire sang a little in cold. He wrote, in a hand that favored conclusions, tonal intrusion repeats every leap year, appears to be coded. Recommend countermeasures and silence. The countermeasure was to drown it. A generator on runners, a bank of resistors, a rack of coils that smelled like chewing on pennies. When the spiral came, the men would flood the line with noise. In 1956 they tried. They stood at the switch while snow burned blue in the dark and listened for the first note, clear as a glass rubbed with a wet finger, higher than engines, lower than wind. When it arrived, the man at the switch threw noise into the wire. The tones changed neither pace nor pitch. The lineman wrote, "It walked through noise as if wearing boots." The captain wrote, "Artifact of expectation." Biology had its own grammar. Sled dogs raised their heads at the first tone and did not bark. In the alluvials, fish that winter over in black water at the bottom turned once together and let themselves drift a meter downstream, then righted themselves as if embarrassed. A reindeer at a camp north of Tomtor stood, shook, and moved its jaw without swallowing. A midwife swore labor came 12 hours early to a woman who had been promised a March child. The baby cried on 3 beats and then settled into a sleep that made the room polite. None of that appears in protocol. All of it returns in whispers that migrate like smoke. By 1960, the Spiral had a minor file in a bureau that had never learned to say no to geography. Teams went out on white days and returned with nothing but frost-bitten noses and coil wire that glittered under lamp. A note suggests the tones are multiples of the Schumann and is stamped misdirected science. Another proposes distant auroral His phase locked by the calendar, which earns a pencil. His has no calendar. The file includes a hand-drawn staff with notes marked as circles, then replaced by numbers as if arithmetic could be a discipline against music. Someone tried to play it on a piano in Yakutsk and made the right noises at the wrong temperature. The janitor in that building reported that the radiators hummed along. He was corrected. An accident made the entry that survives most cleanly. February 29, 1964. A telegraphist in Oymyakon, drunk on night duty, hit record instead of Siend and rolled a wax cylinder for 13 minutes before it ran out. On it. The room, a cough, the stove, a brief silence, then 31 tones spaced with a patience that the sober never find. He took the cylinder home, sobered, and brought it to his supervisor. It was seized, copied, filed under a number that appears nowhere else. A transcription exists in a folder that smells of phenol and dry glue. It starts at 0100 and ends at 13 wangs with the sentence unfinished, like a bridge built to the middle of a river and left there because budgets are decisions. The 1968 committee called it industrial sabotage and punished no one because no one fits in that shape. The 1972 committee called it folklore and proposed a brochure about natural radio of the North. The 1976 memorandum says, briskly, that civilian discussion of calendar tones should be redirected to meteorology. The 1980 paper folded it into geophysical backgrounds and moved the file to a shelf with gulag inventories and flood maps. Things that happen, things you survive, things that leave measurements and teeth marks. But the Spiral kept time the way wolves keep roots. In 1984, a geologist on the Indigirka heard it in his canteen and recorded it on a cassette that later melted on the dashboard of a Gaz truck. In 1988, a radio student in Yakutsk caught it on a home-built receiver and filled the gaps with static because gaps frighten exams. In 1992, in the new country with old winters, a soldier on conscript duty told a woman at the market that the sky counted to 31, like a man who had mislaid his gloves. "It is the day that repeats itself," she said, weighing potatoes. Maybe it is practicing. Which is why the folder opens, with crackle and a smell like pennies, on a page from 1996 that looks like a postcard from a time that should have stopped. It is stamped, February 29th. Subject, unassigned carrier east of Ustnera, migrating in spiral locus. The word spiral is typed without apology. The last line, in pencil, writes itself sideways into a crease. Source traced to nowhere, still present. The pen stopped for a second there, as if the hand holding it had heard something and then remembered to finish its sentence. The stamp is violet. The violet has bled in frost. The Spiral will return in 4 years, and in 4 years after that, and every time someone will write down the number 31 and the word nowhere and a date that refuses to stay gone. The second folder begins with a misaddressed telegram forwarded twice, the paper thin where fingers worried it. 2. Line Station Sarek. From Regional Telegraph, Yakutsk. Date 29/2/1952. Text, report tones per schedule. A clerk has circled schedule and added a question mark backward, as if punctuation freezes in these latitudes. Attached is a map, with pencil triangles marching east of Ustnera, then dissolving into featureless white. Someone has inked a spiral over the last triangle, tight and careful, the way you draw a stove lid when you are thinking of warmth. The legend says source, then nothing else. A team went out with a direction finder on a Gaz AA, the radio rack lashed to boards that creaked like bones. The captain from the committee kept his suitcase between his boots and his eyes on the needle. The operator wore oilskin gloves, cut at the fingertips. He tuned by touch and swore when his nails cracked. The driver counted breaths between drifts. At the first hut, the ledger showed salt and kerosene, and the word spiral written on the wrong line, sideways. The hutman, a man who knew weather like grammar, poured tea that smelled of rust and said, when asked about interference, "It has a patience. It does not argue." They set the loop aerial in the lee of a snow fence and waited for a sky that never quite darkens in the way cities understand. At 1812, the operator heard a tone like a glass stroked with a wet finger. At 1813, a second, exactly spaced. At 1814, a third. The captain wrote times. The driver wrote distances in his head as if the calendar could be measured in versts. At 1843, the 31st note arrived. The operator nodded once and reached for the switch to flood the band with noise. The captain stopped his hand. "Let it finish," he said, an indulgence that sounded like an order. The notes ended, as they always did, with unfinished courtesy. Snow hissed against cloth. Back in Yakutsk, the report calls the tones a migrating unassigned carrier with discrete cadence, a sentence that convinces paper if not men. The appendix lists azimuths. Their intersection falls on an old prison forestry spur that was worked to stumps in the 1930s and abandoned when the rails buckled in thaw. A photograph from an album without a cover shows a siding half-eaten by larch, and beyond it a field that has learned to look like innocence. On the back, a clerk has written, with a city hand unused to permafrost, "No tower, no mast, no hut, nowhere." Witnesses range in age and weather and nouns. A telephonist on the Oymyakon Tomtor stretch says the magneto box on the wall chirps under my hand, as if someone tapped the wire from inside. A hunter north of the Indigirka Bend says his sled dogs do not prick ears but lift their heads, and one puts his chin on snow like a man on a windowsill. A woman who cleaned the schoolhouse at Sordenok hears the notes in the stove grate and presses both palms there, calmly, as if learning a tune. She tells the captain that her mother remembered the same thing in a leap year winter when bread was rock, and laughed because the laughter made her more present to the room than recollection did. Denial arranges itself as policy. A leaflet titled Natural Radio of the North appears in post offices, with a drawing of spark discharge over spruce, and a cheerful caption about the sky singing during storms. Leap years are not mentioned. Schedules are for trains. At meeting, a communications engineer says Aurora, a geophysicist says Whistlers, and a colonel from the fleet says sabotage, and is voted out of the sentence by silence. In a margin, someone writes, privately, Hiss has no calendar. The note is later erased with a rubber that leaves pink wounds. On February 29, 1956, the countermeasure test proceeds. A portable generator, its flywheel oiled to shine, a resistor bank that will make night smell like pennies, a switch polished with wool. The operator listens for the first tone, floods the line with noise. The second tone steps through as if the door had been propped open. They increase amplitude. The third tone comes on time. They retune to 4.6 kHz and then to 4.7 approx. The fourth tone refuses to be chased. The hut stove draws and redraws its breath into the room. The captain writes, no effect. The hutman writes nothing. He wraps his hands in cloth and looks at the calendar pinned above the shelf at the extra square stapled to the end of February, a day like a borrowed room. Biology keeps score without minutes. A net under ice near Kyubyumi comes up with fish that show no marks except a faint brightening along the lateral line, as if someone had run a finger there. A reindeer stumbles, lowers its head, and continues, embarrassed. A woman due in March delivers a child on the 29th and says the labor began with a knock in her ears. The midwife records time as 1903. When asked about the odd precision, she says, The stove told me. The record shows healthy. The child grows into a man who works on pylons and refuses to carry a watch. A thin memorandum from 1958 carries the scent of a borrowed typewriter. Inquire with Glavnauka whether Schumann resonance might be calendar synchronous. The reply is brisk to the point of satire. Resonance not party member, will not attend. In Yakutsk, a technician draws the tone sequence on staff paper for a pianist friend. They try to play it on a Zimmermann with a cracked soundboard. The pianist says the room feels like snow when he reaches the 30th note, and the technician laughs, as one does after a fall. The janitor complains the radiators hum. He is told the building hums during cold. Cold is policy. The first missing document reads like a hallway where a door should be. Telegraphist recording, Oymyakon, 1964, the index says. The sleeve holds only a label and a crumb of wax that smells of paraffin and fingers. In its place, a typed sheet. Transcription, approximate. 31 dashes marched in 2 neat rows, spaces exact enough to embarrass clocks. On the bottom right corner, a child's hand has pressed a coin until the paper took its shape. The coin leaves a green ring that bleeds through the next page and the next. Meanwhile, the spiral acquires a schedule in people before it acquires one in files. Men at Hut S7 step outside during the dusk and stand without hats, listening as if for a team arriving on the winter road. In Yakutsk, students mark Leap Day on their calendars with spirals and meet on the roof with a home-built loop antenna whose solder smells of rosin and fear. Women put out bowls to catch leaks in school roofs and claim the drips hesitate at the 31st note, then hurry as if ashamed. No one writes this formally. They tell it at kitchen tables, and the words learn to fit between tea and bread. A 1960s Komsomol pamphlet on northern wonders prints a photograph of light over snow and calls it polar noctilucence. The caption is from Leningrad, and the light is from a different latitude. In a notebook behind that pamphlet, a lineman named Vasilyev writes, S-P-I-R-A-L. We spelled it out tapping the wire with a spoon. The notes answered with their own pace. I don't think it was us, but we were present. He signs with a block V that could be anyone's. He dies in 1971 of a winter, and his wife uses the notebook to settle wobbly furniture. By 1968, the file produces reforms. Redirect civilian inquiry to Meteorological Bureau. Prohibit unsanctioned recordings. Fold observations into geophysical backgrounds. Review leap year schedules in communications offices. Do not amplify. Do not amplify reads like electrical advice and social doctrine at once. The captain counters with lists of radios confiscated and cylinders taken and a sentence that looks like metaphysics under a stamp. Calendar is a weapon in the wrong hands. No names appear below it. The stamp bleeds violet. A final sheet in this folder is a telegram with a brittle edge. 2. All line huts east of Ust-Nera. From Yakutsk. Date 29/2/1960. Text, if heard, report only length. A reply from Sarek comes 6 hours later. Length, enough for counting reindeer to sleep. End. The clerk in Yakutsk copies it neatly into the ledger and underlines reindeer twice, either in irritation or envy. He adds privately below the line and off the clock. Also, stove breathed. Also, dogs listened like men. He sands his pencil mark with an eraser before the page is photographed for the archive. The camera misses the indentation his words left. Paper keeps dents the way permafrost keeps bones. The spiral, obliging and indifferent, files itself for the next leap year without asking permission. By 1964, the file begins to pretend it is a science. A Yakutsk institute borrows an aircraft with a loop aerial bolted like an extra rib. Its navigator traces circles over the Indigirka Bend until fuel arithmetic forbids curiosity. Bearings scribble inward around a coordinate that refuses to be a coordinate. A flat of wind-packed snow, where a camp ledger from 1937 lists saws, chains, and 42 pairs of felt boots. The camp name, Severny 12, appears once, then is lined through in red, and replaced by a dash as clean as an amputation. A photograph shows nothing but blue shadow and one dark thread that might be a rail asleep under white. The pilot writes on the back, "Silence, except for tones. Cold climbs into teeth." Leap Day 1968, the spiral comes during a power outage that makes the whole region honest. The tones find the deadline anyway, arriving in magnetos and stove grates, in a tin cup on a school shelf, in the wire fence around a cattle yard whose last cow died a decade ago. A committee insists this proves expectation. The captain argues it proves carrier. The hutman at Sarek writes in the ledger, "Herd in mittens." His supervisor scratches it out for the audit and later puts it back in softer pencil because erasing a sentence feels like disrespect to weather. The first graduate thesis hovers like breath over cold glass. Title, Calendar Synchronous Narrowband Phenomena in Subarctic Wire Plant. The student, thin, kind to equipment, prints spectrograms where the tones rise like stitching. He proposes skywave ducting and concludes with unsatisfactory evidence, an honesty that costs him a posting. In a cardboard box his mother saves, the appendix holds a hand-drawn spiral with 31 radial marks and a note. Each tone a spoke. Hub is nowhere. The box smells of dust and cardamom. Witness accounts begin to agree in odd places. A nurse in Tomtor records a pulse that marches with the tones for exactly 5 beats and then resumes its human error. A hunter ties his dog to a willow before the first note so he can watch the ears. They do not move, but the dog's chest does, in little bows. A teacher notices chalk squeak once, twice, then glide. On the ice road, a driver reports his headlights dim politely during the 31st note and come back as if apologizing. None of these are admissible, and all of them occur again. 1972 produces the only document that risks metaphor under seal. The spiral manifests a habit independent of our equipment. Countermeasures behave as weather to it. The author signs with 3 initials that could belong to anyone brave. He recommends silence over spectacle, dismantling of unsanctioned loops, and a rotation of leap night personnel so no one learns a rhythm. The second page, attached by brass fastener, instructs telegraph offices to schedule maintenance on February 29th to reduce public occupancy of lines. In Yakutsk, a clerk writes out the order 3 times because the ribbon is faint and the words feel brittle. Meanwhile, a rumor collects a geography of its own. East of Ust-Nera, there is said to be a settlement that does not appear on maps, whose last stove went cold the winter the rail split, whose name was harvested from signboards for use as kindling. The spiral is its roll call, say men who do not enjoy telling stories. The 31 notes count not days, but heads. A woman who was a girl there says she remembers a bell that had no clapper and a shed with a wire that ran into the ground and never came out. She does not remember leaving. She does not sign her statement. The margin bears 3 dots in graphite, pressed hard enough to dent. The 1972 leap day arrives with aurora predicted and does not need it. The tones step off at 1812 like a unit that nose drill. The DF van in the lee of a drift draws an inward spiral on a map and stops when the pencil point punctures paper. The captain, older now, writes, length 31. He does not write what he feels when his palm rests against the hut's jamb and finds it faintly warm between notes, as if the wood had learned to attend. Back in the city, a director stamps a summation. Source traced to no installation. Public inquiry to be met with meteorology. Next occurrence in 4. At the bottom, under the stamp, the clerk adds the date, 29, 1972. He inks the second I twice because the pen stutters on leap days. The reformers of 1976 preferred brochures to auguries. A packet arrived in Yakutsk titled Natural Radio of the North, 2nd edition, its diagrams tidy, its captions domesticated. The leap day was omitted like an impolite uncle. In a back office, someone stapled to it an internal circular. No unsanctioned listening posts east of Ust-Nera. Confiscate home-built loop antennas. Leap night rosters rotated to avoid habituation. The captain, promoted sideways, initialed the order and packed a suitcase that clicked even when empty. He still traveled to Sarek on years that demanded it, still stood in the lee of the fence while snow wrote its horizontal script across his boots. A test was authorized that winter and never fully admitted. 2 synchronized direction finders, one at the forestry spur, one on a ridge above the bend, a third receiver flown lazy circles in a lie 2 until fuel frightened the pilot into prudence. The 3 sets of bearings converged not at a mast or a pit head or any of the places engineers like to point to, but 20 kilometers east of Severny 12, in a field where the snow lay so flat it looked ironed. The report, stamped twice, read, "Apparent source remains uninstrumented terrain." A pencil beneath the stamp, not quite erased, added, "Nowhere yet present." Witness accounts thickened, then learned to hide. A woman in Sordenach wrote that her stove grate spoke coins on the second note. The letter returned with a kind explanation about metals and frost. A driver on the Coloma traced rings in fog with his headlights and swore the 31st note made the halo pinch in, then relax. A hospital orderly described a patient exhaling on the tones as if someone were counting for him. None of this made it into the master file. All of it traveled by mouth, which is a transport harder to interdict than rail. Leap Day 1976 arrived with aurora that forgot its cue and a wind that did not. The tones stepped through the noise everyone had learned to make. Radios left on as decoys, kettles boiled to thicken the substation's breath, metal tapped without rhythm to frighten pattern. They came at 1812, polite as always, and left at 19, with the last note shaved by a gust that knocked spoons against enamel in 100 kitchens. The DF operators wrote their lines without adjectives. The hutman at Sarek added a private entry. Dogs lay their chins down for the duration. Fire draws even as if read to. The first cassette that survives lives in a shoebox that once held boots, then onions, then this. A radio student in Yakutsk, warned off by professors and encouraged by friends, built a receiver from salvage and set it to listen on Leap Night 1976. The tape captured room hum, and someone coughing, and laid over that, 31 tones that make the hair on the wrist stand up if you have learned such responses. She labeled it simply 29-2. Years later, the oxide will flake. For now, the notes step cleanly, as if acquiescing to be archived. 1978 brought a committee with a new vocabulary. Calendar entrainment, narrowband spiral locus, environmental coupling. It recommended painting down folkloric vectors and standardizing explanations across agencies. A pamphlet appeared with drawings of St. Elmo's fire and katabatic winds. In the margin of one copy, a lineman wrote, "Hiss has no calendar. Weather has no schedule. The spiral keeps one." On February 29, 1980, the region lost power for 12 honest minutes during a storm that organized itself without consultation. The tones arrived anyway. No wire to carry them, yet they came. They were heard in a fence, in a kettle lid, in the teeth of a man who had bit down on a cartridge once and sworn off metaphor since. A 3-man crew at the forestry spur, pretending to rehang insulators in darkness, reported their loop aerial useless, their ears efficient. 31, the captain wrote. He did not add that the wood of the hut felt warm between notes as if attentive. He did not tell the clerk that the clerk's pen, writing the date, stuttered at the second I in 29-2, because the clerk knew that already. After the storm, the do not amplify doctrine expanded. Leap night maintenance was scheduled for urban lines. Cinemas held electrification of the North films to keep radios off, and the Meteorology Bureau issued a statement on auroral hiss that would serve as explanation for 10 years. In kitchens, bowls still paused their leak at the 30th tone. In pens, reindeer still shifted and pretended they had not. In wards, a pulse or two still tried to march with the wire and lost interest. The file thickened with denials that learned to quote themselves, and yet the spiral on the DF maps tightened, as if the bearings were learning to admit where nowhere lay. Under the last set, a hand, perhaps hers, the radio student's grown into a technician, penciled softly, "If there was a place, it is absent. If there was a name, it was borrowed. If there was a signal, it remembers a hand." The words were erased before copying, but the dents remain. Paper does not heal the way snow does. The spiral scheduled its next return on a day the calendar lends without affection, and the men with suitcases put their hands on the loop aerials as if to steady themselves against a stairwell that had decided to shift underfoot. Perestroika arrived like a new stamp, and the file learned different nouns without changing its minutes. Leap Day, 1984. The DF vans drew the same inward spiral. The bearings froze within a kilometer of the forestry spur. A typed line reads, "Apex, uninstrumented terrain." In the hut, the stove breathed evenly. Outside, dogs laid their heads down. A geophysicist from Leningrad brought a clean oscilloscope and a plan to quantize the cadence. His graph showed 31 uprights like teeth, equal spacing that made decoding attractive. "Base 31, he whispered to a technician who had learned to keep words from paper. The technician wrote on a scrap, "Do not enumerate," a rule that had traveled from other offices, other climates. The geophysicist returned west and published a paper on auroral phase stability with no mention of calendars. His oscilloscope photographs later appeared taped inside a locker at the Yakutsk transmitter, the tape yellowed around the edges like old tea. The 1988 Leap Day wore policy like a coat, 2 sizes too large. A television crew from Vladivostok arrived with optimism and a sound man who had worked mines. They set up in Sarek, loop antenna dressed as a prop, and cut away to snow. At 1812, their Nagra rolled polite hiss. At 1813, the first tone laid a line across the tape like a ruler. At 1814, the second arrived and the battery gauge dipped, then returned with manners. The director whispered, "Drama," and the sound man shook his head. After, the cassettes returned from Moscow with leader where notes had been. "Handling," the letter explained. The sound man visited the hutman that summer with 2 sacks of flour and left with nothing but a phrase he did not use in cities. "It counts us without asking." Witnesses multiplied and then learned discretion. A nurse in Tomtor had 3 patients wake from operations on Leap Day as if at a bell. She wrote "timing" in the margin and sanded it away with an eraser that left pink crumbs. A reindeer herder north of the bend tied bells to a line to "see wind." On the 31st note, the bells ceased, not by swinging, but by intention, and then resumed. He cut the bells off and hung them in a shed where no one would mistake them for evidence. A postmaster reported rubber stamps, leaving faint violet even when dry, between 1812 and 19. He replaced pads and found the same. The archive acquired gaps that looked like decisions. The 1964 cylinder vanished to a centralization effort. The 1976 cassette survived only as a third-generation dub in a shoebox under onions. A sealed envelope labeled $29, Tsu, 1980, returned from Moscow with a stamp in English, undeliverable, and a faint smell of metal. The captain, called now by a title that noticed weather less, retired with his suitcase and a habit of waking at 1812 on leap days, regardless of longitude. In his private notebook, the last entry is a sentence without subjects. Heard in mittens, stove attentive, source nowhere, length 31. 1992 tried to cancel the calendar and failed. The region's lines were half paid and honest. The spiral arrived anyway. Students in Yakutsk stood on a dorm roof with a loop of copper hammered from cable and heard, in the headphones that smelled of other heads, 31 tones like the polite counting of an absent clerk. They wrote the numbers on a napkin and later fed the napkin to a stove because ash feels safer than filing. A radio shop sold blank tapes at a discount on February 28th. On March 1st, several were returned with complaints of print-through, faint ghosts of tones where nothing had been recorded. The shopkeeper shrugged and swapped them for new because refunds are a doctrine that travels. In the last page of this folder, a memo proposes, almost tenderly, to stop looking. Fold leap day phenomena into folklore. Maintain maintenance schedules. Discourage enumeration. Advise that all soils contain iron. The approving stamp is light gray, as if the pad were tired. In pencil below, dented so hard the paper shines, a hand writes what the file has refused to. It will return in 4. The next folder begins with a smell like pennies and snow. The new country learned to make invoices, but not to quiet minutes. Leap Day 1996. A petroleum survey crew hired out of Mirny set geophones in a line that stitched the snow. Their truck radio caught the spiral at 1812 and logged it as cultural noise, the term for songs from villages. There were no villages. The supervisor ordered a pause to let the earth speak. The tones stepped through anyway. 31 in patient file order. The report billed extra hours for waiting. In the crew diary, a rough hand wrote, "Counted us without asking." He tore the page out and used it to light a stove. Telecom arrived on snowmobiles with towers that blinked red through fog. An engineer with foreign tools tied a ground strap to a bolt that had once belonged to a forestry spur. On Leap Night 2000, the mast's sync light faltered at the second tone, recovered, faltered again at the 30th, then steadied like a man remembering his rank. A maintenance log printed Anomaly Cluster plus 3S, neat as a grid. The page smelled of toner and metal. In Yakutsk, a consultant explained it as leap second confusion. The spiral does not keep seconds, it keeps count. A geophysicist who had been a student in 1976 returned with a digital recorder and a son who could solder. They set a loop on the Indigirka plain where a rail sleeps under larch and listened in headphones that made ears sweat. The son grinned when the first tone came. Clean, thin, higher than engines, lower than fear. At the 30th, his smile slid off as if a string had been pulled. "This is only signal," he said, competent. And the father nodded, competent, and wrote nothing because competence does not cover wood that feels attentive between notes. The state tried a modern denial, a website explaining auroral hiss with moving diagrams and friendly fonts. Leap days were not clickable. A comment appeared under the article. Heard in fence, heard in cup, and vanished. A second comment said, source traced to nowhere, then erased itself as the page refreshed. In an office with dry air and no windows, a man printed the page and underlined nowhere because the shape of the word did not change in ink. Witnesses adapted their nouns. A nurse now called it episode clustering. A driver said his GPS lagged polite half steps at 18:12:19. On the 29th, he filed multipath. A herder's bell ceased again on the 31st tone, though no one had tied it. It hung from a nail in a shed that mice had chewed but not entered. A schoolteacher asked her class to draw a spring. 3 children drew spirals with 31 spokes and called them suns. She hung the pictures in a corridor and told herself they were suns. 2004 produced a clean spectrogram. 31 needles, perfect spacing, amplitude conservative, like a voice that knows rooms. The technician who printed it wrote, "Base 31?" in pencil, and then rubbed it until the paper glassed. His supervisor, who had a scar from a winter and a shortage of adjectives, took the sheet home and slid it behind a picture of a dog. The dog looked away from the camera. The sheet turned the color of tea. The spiral returned in 2008 and 2012 and 2016, and each time someone wrote artifact with less ink. Missing evidence learned the manners of the age. A folder labeled 29-2-2008 corrupted itself the week before audit. A hard drive with field notes from 2012 spun, clicked at the 30th tone, and never mounted again. A drone over the 7012 spur shot a grid of photographs with no coordinates. The frame at 1812 shows a flat that looks ironed. The frame at 1813 shows the same. The metadata insists on both. A graduate student wrote a thesis on calendar synchronous interference in tundra networks and defended it to a room that watched the clock. He passed. His PDF link later returned 404. A letter arrived in 2016 from a woman in Kandiga, written on squared paper with a school pen. My mother said a bell without hammer called the camps to roll call. I hear 31 notes and count my children. Each time they answer, "Please do not come." No reply was filed. The envelope smelled of soap and wood smoke. The violet stamp bled in humidity. Leap Day 2020 fell on a world that had already learned to hold its breath. The spiral kept its schedule. In a clinic, a pulse oximeter flatlined for 3 beats and resumed. The nurse called it sensor error and reset gently. In a server room in Yakutsk, a synchronized clock hiccuped at 1812 and rejoined the swarm as if embarrassed. On the Indigirka, a man in a hut with a ledger that now held Wi-Fi passwords and paraffin noted, as his predecessor did, length 31. He added lower, smaller, the kind of script you use when you talk to wood, heard in mittens. He did not send that line. He left it as a dent on paper by pressing too hard. The dent remains in the copy. The spiral scheduled itself again with no need for permission. 4 years is a habit. The file drew breath and made room on the shelf. Preparations for 2024 looked like competence wearing extra gloves. A consortium leased overflight rights for environmental baselining, which meant a turboprop with LiDAR tracing green combs over flats east of Ust-Nera. A telecom firm cached batteries at hut sites for community resilience. A university shipped synchronized recorders packed in gray foam that smelled of newness. Every box carried a sticker. Do not tamper. Calibration. The hutman at Sarek, whose ledger now mixed Wi-Fi passwords with paraffin, wrote under the date 29/2, tea left to cool, dogs attentive, not alert. At 1811, the LiDAR operator watched the raster crawl. At 1812, a single scan line returned blank, as if a ribbon of air had declined to reflect. The aircraft logged GPS jitter, plus 31 ms, and corrected in place like a man straightening his hat. On the ground, the synchronized recorders stamped second markers that were true before and after, and modestly uncertain for the length of a spoon tapped thrice on enamel. A Chinese-made field spectrometer printed 31 uprights like tidy teeth. The graduate student holding the paper wrote, "Base 31," then rubbed it away until the gloss changed. The telecom mast on the forestry spur blinked wrong once, professional shame in LED. A Starlink dish on a miner's roof lost lock for the count of 3 breaths and reacquired the sky with a noise like apology. In a clinic, a nurse watched a pulse trace waver into a pattern that was not human and then remember itself. She wrote artifact on the chart because words for weather do not bill. On the Indigirka, Burbot turned once in their under-ice dark and let the current borrow them a meter, a behavior someone's grandfather had recorded with a thumb against a line, and no one would now admit knowing. DF vans with dashboards that preferred touch to knobs drew the same inward spiral. The apex fell, clean as an erasure, on ironed snow 20 kilometers east of the buckled rail. A drone hovered over the coordinate and returned images of a flat so featureless the compression algorithm misjudged it for sky. The team lead suggested phase-locked skywave on seasonal ducting. The hutman poured tea and said to the stove, "It counts, an ontology that does not require grant codes." People behaved like instruments that had learned courtesy. A boy in Tomtor set his metronome to 60 and felt it hesitate on the 31st click. He closed it and listened to the great breathe coins. A woman in Kandiga wrote her children's names on squared paper and checked them off as the notes arrived in the wire fence. Afterward, she burned the square and stirred the ash into snow. In Yakutsk, the old radio student, hair white, solder still neat, played her 1976 cassette beside the new file. The old ticks and the new uprights agreed more than strangers usually do. Denial modernized without learning humor. A ministry site posted an animation of auroral hiss set to cheerful colors. The leap day was not clickable. A telecom bulletin blamed leap-second rollover, then corrected itself because there was none. A memo advised operators not to publish enumerated events. The word enumerated carried the stale perfume of other offices. Under it, someone penciled, "Do not count," then sanded the graphite until the page shone. At 19, the 31st tone ended with its usual unfinished courtesy. The LiDAR scan line resumed as if a zipper had closed. GPS jitter vanished into swarm obedience. Dogs exhaled. The mast returned to schedule. The graduate student, alone with the printer's warmth, watched the teeth cool to paper. She wrote nothing because the nouns she owned were poor. The hutman closed his ledger with a palm that left a salt print and did not send a report. He pressed the pencil harder until a dent remained. After, a server mirrored its data and produced a hash that differed by one step in 31. The lab deleted and re-downloaded and called the change network weather. A foreign email asked whether the apex had moved. The reply returned undeliverable inviolate. The folder for 29-dose 2024 smells of toner and coins. The last line is a courtesy to habit. Next in 4. Someone underlined 4 twice, and beneath the second underline the paper has taken a bruise as if from a thumb. The way permafrost keeps a boot print through spring. The spiral files itself without permission. People fold their maps, whether they admit it or not, along a crease that leads to nowhere. After 2024, the archive begins to gather edges instead of pages. A field team from Yakutsk that promised a ground truth transect east of the spur returned with odometer numbers that disagreed by 31 meters every kilometer, then reconciled themselves as if embarrassed. Their drone log shows flawless flight until 1812, then a block of identical frames, white with a faint helix of compression scars, then normal again. The pilot filed buffer duplication. The insurance company circled the timestamp and stamped unprovable. The drone was found later in perfect condition on a flat that looked ironed, landing legs dusted with hoarfrost like powdered sugar. Its SD card mounted on the second try and politely forgot a minute. Disappearance changed grammar from rumor to form. A lineman named Pshelkin, who had carried spoons in his pocket to test fences for sound and laughed at himself for it, filed for leave to see a sister in Kansk and never boarded. His time card shows him clocking out 29 to second. At 17:58, handwriting even, ink unblotted. The hut log at Sarek carries. Lower down, Pshelkin present in a second hand, then scratched lightly as if the pencil had stuttered. Weeks later, a padded envelope arrived at the cooperative in Yakutsk with no return. Inside, a loop of wire neatly coiled, 3 dots of solder along one side, and a scrap of squared paper with the word "enough" pressed into it hard enough to bruise the fibers. The paper smelled of paraffin and bread. Environmental reports began to include metrics no instrument had requested. A fisheries memo notes lateral line fluorescence in burbot sampled on March 1st, reversible with darkness. A health inspector in Tomtor records an uptick in nosebleeds that clump around leap night dawn, advises humidification, and moves on. A forestry sheet mentions spiral growth aberrations in saplings at the old spur, rings that make a staircase when you slice them, then adds, in parentheses, survey tape possibly magnetized. The parenthesis survives a redaction that takes everything else. Denial learned to wear data. A telecom bulletin released a plot of mast sync anomalies and labeled the cluster offline diagnostics. The LiDAR consortium published a figure with the blank scan line smoothed into a gradient and a caption about albedo variance. At a public meeting in Yakutsk, a man who introduced himself as a radio amateur asked whether the ministry intended to prohibit listening as well as enumeration. The deputy smiled with authority and said, "There is nothing to enumerate," a sentence that tasted in the room like iron. Survivors spoke if you let them keep their own nouns. The woman in Kondiga, who once wrote to count her children, met the camera in profile and said the 31 notes feel like walking past doors, not opening them, not knocking. A retired pilot who had flown the Li-2 over the spiral locus in 1964 described the cold climbing his teeth and then laughed without teeth. The radio student of 1976, now careful with words, played both tapes, oxide and digital, low, and said only that the room knew when to listen. She showed a cassette labeled 29 de Sue and a flash drive labeled the same, and slid both into a box with mothballs as if signals attracted moths. Files thinned themselves like hair. The 2024 server hash that differed by one step in 31 was marked network weather and pushed to a colder archive. 2 years later, an intern could not wake the disk. The synchronized recorder that had printed perfect teeth failed calibration in June during a thunderstorm, and a service ticket closed itself at 0310 with no fault found. A grant to map calendar synchronous interference in subarctic wire plant failed to advance for reasons of priority. Its principal investigator moved to an institute farther south where minutes belong to clocks. Local folklore rearranged thresholds. Children were told to hum at 1812 on leap day so the wire would not feel alone. Old men wrapped knives in cloth without remembering why. Someone chalked "Do Not Count" on the inside of the hut door, where only men with tools would see it. In Tomtor, a market vendor sold copper bracelets with 31 twists for headaches, and a clinic nurse bought one and hid it under her cuff. On a fence near Sarek Bend, someone tied 3 bells and cut them off the next day. The nails remained, shining like small teeth. The apex, when plotted across decades, does not move enough to justify the paper. Bearings converge upon the same nowhere a little tighter each time, as if the map were remembering a crease. Under the newest spiral, a pencil has left 3 dents where dots must have been, then rubbed until the gloss changed. In the margin a hand writes, not daring ink, "If there was a town, it learned to be absent. If there was a roll call, it forgot names on purpose." The sentence is not filed. It is present the way cold is, by making the absence of heat specific. In the last entry of this section, a clerk in Yakutsk stamps 29 de second 2024, pauses, then stamps the second I again, so the line is darker than rules require. He folds the page and fits it into a jacket that has carried other winters and walks to a room without windows. In that room, the violet of older stamps has bled through boxes to make constellations no atlas admits. He places the page under a heavier file labeled Floods and closes the cabinet. The light flickers once as if a mast far away had blinked off time. He checks his watch and says nothing because names are corridors. Outside, on flats east of Ustnera, the snow looks ironed and tastes of nothing at all, and somewhere under it, a rail sleeps and becomes a line someone has taught themselves not to follow. The spiral will return in 4. People rearrange their lives around not saying that out loud. The file for 2028 opens with a smell of toner and snowmelt and a page already creased where someone folded it before the stamp was dry. Preparations are modest and tired. 2 synchronized recorders returned from calibration with stickers that curled at the edges. A LiDAR slot negotiated, if clear. A memo to Telecom reminding that leap seconds are not scheduled this year. In Sarek, the hut ledger now begins months with Wi-Fi passwords and ends days with paraffin counts. Under 29-2. A neat hand writes, "Leave tea, check dogs, no enumeration." At 1812, the first tone arrived without sentiment. A recorder printed teeth like always, 31 uprights, except the 21st sat faintly taller than its neighbors, a courtesy anyone could ignore. The technician labeled it Artifact, and in pencil, a smaller word, Habit. The LiDAR scan line returned blank for the width of a scarf. The pilot circled once and watched the blank move with the aircraft, as if the air had learned to keep pace. On the forestry spur, the mast blinked wrong at 1813, righted itself, blinked wrong again at 1843, and then remembered the contract. A clinic oximeter in Tomtor stitched a flat line for 3 beats and resumed with grace. The nurse smoothed the sheet and wrote "Censor." Disappearance resumed as a format. The hut at Sarek logged Pshelkin, absent. Then, later, a different hand added present, with the question mark light, like a courtesy knock. A padded envelope addressed to no one arrived at the Yakutsk Cooperative containing a loop of copper hammered thin and a slip of paper with the number 31 pressed into it so hard the fibers shone. The postmark bled. The concierge filed it under lost after deciding lost was the only word that did not invite inspection. A graduate student wrote code to cross-correlate decades of bearings and learned what the map had been trying to say in eraser dents. The apex does not move. The uncertainty shrinks. Her advisor annotated in red, statistically stationary reflector in uninstrumented terrain. She wrote in pencil, under the annotation, if this were a town, it would be practicing being absent. The dean asked her to remove metaphor from drafts. She moved it to the margin where it printed through. The ministry tried a louder denial. A press conference in Yakutsk displayed cheerful plots of auroral bands that wore colors wrong for latitude and answered no questions about calendars. A telecom engineer, cornered after, allowed that synchronization anomalies cluster on certain dates. Holidays, he said, as if that were the same as leap day. A television piece cut from interviews with old men who smiled too carefully, and a young meteorologist who tried to speak about inversions while the boom mic wrote a welt at 1812 across the soundtrack. On broadcast, the welt was replaced by stock wind. Folklore compacted into rules. Do not whistle at 1812. Do not count aloud on leap day. Wrap knives. Let kettles decide. Mothers wrote children's names on squared paper and burned the squares after the last tone. At the tram stop in Yakutsk, do not count appeared in chalk and was washed away by a rain that arrived out of season and left the letters readable as dents. In a dormitory, students placed a bowl on a radiator and marked its ring after the 31st note. In the morning, the ring had moved a finger's width, then changed its mind and returned. The file gains a photograph that pretends not to know what it shows. A flat east of Ust-Nera at 1814, sky low, snow ironed, a faint thread in the foreground that could be a rail or a crease in the negative. The caption says, Apex area, uninstrumented. On the back, in pencil, someone presses 3 dots where a signature would go and rubs them until the paper shines. The photograph goes back into the sleeve backward, as if the part that touches more paper could be worn away faster. After, servers reconcile hashes and disagree politely by 1 step in 31. A synchronized clock in a lab loses time for exactly a breath and then remembers its discipline without needing correction. A fisheries note mentions lateral line brightness again and is redacted down to sampling error. The hut ledger in Sarek closes the day with dogs attentive, not alert. Stove breathed between notes. The copy kept for audit contains the first sentence and not the second. The dents of the second remain. There is a postcard, undelivered, addressed to 7012, if exists, stamped and returned violet, no such address. On it a woman's hand, roll call heard. I will answer if called, but no one should call. The violet has bled through to the picture side, tinting the snow a color it never wears. The folder closes with a clipped sentence in a clerk's careful print. Next in 4. Under it, rubbed hard enough to gloss the paper, if there was a name, it is learned not to be spoken. The cabinet takes the weight. Outside, the flat east of Ust-Nera keeps its face. The month returns to arithmetic. People teach themselves again not to say the number out loud. They draft a closure memo and call it heritage because endings mark it better than absences. Yakutia Spiral, Natural Radio Mythos. The brochure smiles above a photograph taken at noon when even iron snow looks harmless. Bullet points, auroral hiss, infrastructure modernized, community outreach. A QR code leads to an animation where tones wear pastel and calendars are tactfully unclickable. The museum gift shop sells copper bracelets with 31 twists and a postcard of a flat east of Ustnera captioned Apex Area, uninstrumented. The violet ink on the card bleeds like thaw. The archive learns to breathe shallow. Boxes migrate to a drier room. The old violet stamps freckle lids like a sky that forgot its stars. A clerk with careful print copies forward the last line. Next in 4, then presses so hard the paper shines. He files a cassette labeled 29-2, beside a flash drive labeled the same, and places a mothball between them, a superstition learned from people who outlived lists. In the corridor, someone chalks, "Do not count," and a janitor wipes it until the words survive as dents. Witnesses age into nouns. The radio student from 1976, hair white, solder neat, says only, "Rooms learn," and closes her cassette box. The hutman writes, "Dogs attentive, not alert," and keeps the unfiled second sentence for the stove. A geophysicist who once whispered base 31 practices a lecture about His and shows students a spectrogram with one needle slightly taller than its neighbors and calls it artifact. A nurse in Tomtor folds squared paper, counts names silently into the fold, and burns it when the kettle decides. Developers propose a wind farm that would dress the flats in orderly teeth. Consultants cite albedo. A public hearing rehearses weather. The mast blinks on contract, and once, briefly, off time. A synchronized clock loses one breath at 1812 on a leap day demo and regains it with professional cheer. The press release calls it firmware. A fisheries memo mentions lateral line brightness and vanishes into parentheses. A postcard addressed Severny 12, if exists, returns violet, no such address. What remains are manners. People do not enumerate before breakfast. Knives sleep in cloth. Children learn to hum at 1812 without knowing why. On leap years, a dish on a radiator walks a finger's width and then corrects itself out of courtesy. DF maps draw spirals that tighten toward nothing in particular. Under the newest bearing, 3 faint dents mark where dots were rubbed away. Paper keeps dents the way permafrost keeps bones. You can explain it cleanly. Auroral ducks, calendar psychology, a myth fattened on attention. You can say the Union erased at camp, and the spiral is only the echo of that erasure in wires and memory. Or you can stand east of Ustnera in air that tastes of pennies and glass, and feel a room inhale at 1812 and count 31 doors you are not asked to open. The file does not resolve, it rearranges. The cabinet shuts with a breath. The violet bleeds, the flat keeps its face. And somewhere under iron snow, a rail remembers a timetable that maps no stations, only a habit. In 4 years, the tones will arrive without asking. Whether they are calling a place that learned to be absent or teaching us to forget how to answer remains a matter of policy, which is another word for silence.